She can't even hold a fork properly. Why is she here?" The voice came from the far end of the boardroom table, casual and unhurried, the way people speak when they've never once been afraid of consequences. Every head turned. Cutlery paused mid-air, the room, which had been humming with the polite noise of a charity gala dinner repurposed into a networking event, went suddenly, completely still. Nathan Beauchamp didn't look up from his plate right away. He was seated 3 chairs down, halfway through a conversation about infrastructure funding with someone whose name he'd already forgotten. But he heard it. Everyone heard it. At the head of the accessible seating section, a woman sat with her right arm resting in a molded brace, her left hand holding a glass of water with careful precision. She was dressed in a charcoal blazer, silver earrings, hair pulled back clean. She looked every bit the senior partner of a law firm, which, Nathan would learn later, she was. Dr. Vivienne Aldred, 38 years old. Nerve damage from a surgical accident 2 years ago that had taken the full use of her right hand and ended a decade-long career as one of Vancouver's most respected reconstructive surgeons. The man who'd spoken, broad-shouldered, red-faced in the way of someone 3 glasses in, was already leaning toward his companion with a smirk. "I'm just saying, the foundation could have given her spot to someone who can actually participate." Nathan set down his fork. He wasn't the type to make scenes. He'd spent 20 years building Beauchamp Environmental Solutions from a 2-man operation out of a Kelowna garage into a national firm with 400 employees. He'd learned early that measured responses outlasted loud ones. His mother had taught him that. She'd also taught him that silence, at the wrong moment, was its own kind of cowardice. He stood up. He walked the length of the table without hurrying, stopped beside Vivienne Aldred's chair. He didn't look at the man who'd spoken. He looked at her. "I think they moved the keynote to the East Terrace," he said quietly. "Want to get out of here?" Vivienne Aldred looked up at him. Her expression was controlled. The kind of control that costs something, but her eyes were sharp, assessing. She didn't know him. He could see that. She was deciding whether this was pity or something else. He waited. "Sure," she said finally. He didn't take the handles of her wheelchair. He walked beside her, matching her pace, as she guided herself toward the exit. Behind them, the room exhaled. Outside, the October air off Burrid Inlet was cold and clean and smelled faintly of salt and rain-soaked cedar. The terrace was mostly empty. String lights ran along the railing. Below, the water was black and silver. "You didn't have to do that," Vivienne said. "I know." A pause. "Nathan Beauchamp," he said, extending his hand. "Environmental consulting. I do a lot of work with the foundation." She shifted her water glass to her left hand and shook his. Her grip was firm and deliberate. "Vivienne Aldred, former surgeon, current liability, apparently." He almost laughed. The dryness in it caught him off guard. "Former?" "Nerve damage." She said it the way people say words they've said 10,000 times. Without drama. "Right hand. I can't operate anymore." "I'm sorry." She looked out at the water. "People keep saying that." He leaned against the railing. "Does it get annoying?" "Deeply." This time he did laugh, and after a moment so did she, brief, surprised, as though she hadn't expected to. They talked for 40 minutes, not about her hand, not about the man inside, about the Foundation's reforestation project, about a paper she'd read on trauma-informed care in rural communities, about the fact that the caterers had run out of the wild sockeye before half the table had been served, which she felt was the evening's actual injustice. When a colleague came to tell Nathan they needed him for a photo, he paused. "There's a food truck," he said, "on Granville, near the bridge. Best poutine in the city, and I'll fight anyone who disagrees. I'm heading there after this if you want." She raised an eyebrow. "Poutine?" "I know, cliché, but I mean it about the fries." She studied him for a moment. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded and left. She was already there when he arrived. The poutine was genuinely excellent. They sat at a folding table under the food truck's awning, paper containers between them, the city noise a comfortable presence around them. Vivienne ate with her left hand, efficient and unbothered. At one point, a gust of wind knocked her napkin into her lap, and she caught it with her wrist before Nathan had even registered what happened. 12 months of occupational therapy," she said, noticing his expression. "You learn things." "What kinds of things?" that your non-dominant hand is far more capable than you ever gave it credit for. A pause. That grief and adaptation are not the same process, and people keep confusing them. Another pause. That poutine is significantly better eaten outside in the cold than inside at a gala. I've believed that last one my whole life. She smiled, not the polite smile from inside, something smaller and more real. He didn't hover. He didn't offer to help with things she hadn't asked for help with. When the container tilted slightly on the uneven table surface, he steadied the table, not her food. She noticed. He could tell she noticed because the small tension she'd been holding in her shoulders, not visible to most people, but visible to him, he wasn't sure why, eased by a degree. They were there for 2 hours. Walking back to her vehicle, she paused at a curb cut blocked by a poorly parked catering van. Nathan looked at it for a moment, then stepped into the street and flagged down a passing cyclist asked to move. The cyclist looked annoyed, then looked at the situation, then moved without a word. "You didn't have to do that either," Vivian said. "Also know that." She looked at him sideways. There was something in her face he couldn't quite read. Not gratitude exactly. Recognition, maybe. Like she was trying to determine whether he was actually what he appeared to be, or whether this was a performance with an expiration date. "I'll see you around, Nathan Beauchamp," she said. "I hope so," he said honestly. They fell into a rhythm the way people do, when neither of them is willing to admit it's deliberate. A coffee near her rehabilitation appointments on Tuesdays. A farmer's market on Saturdays, because Vivian had opinions about Ontario peaches versus BC peaches that she was not willing to leave undefended. An afternoon at the Vancouver Art Gallery, where they spent 45 minutes in front of a single Emily Carr painting and agreed to disagree about whether the forest in it felt peaceful or suffocating. Nathan had not intended any of this. He had a company to run, a board that had been pressuring him to merge with a Calgary firm he didn't trust, and a mother in Kamloops who called every Sunday to ask whether he was eating enough vegetables. He had not been looking for anything. But Vivian Aldred was the kind of person who made you want to think more carefully. She asked questions that assumed you'd thought about things before answering. She remembered details from conversations 3 weeks old. She had a particular quality of stillness when she was listening, not absence, but presence, complete and unhurried, and Nathan, who spent most of his days being managed and negotiated with and maneuvered around, found it startling. One afternoon at the farmer's market, a vendor's table display caught on her wheelchair's footrest as she passed, pulling a potted lavender plant off the edge. Nathan caught it before it hit the ground. He set it back on the table, then glanced at her footrest, crouched down and straightened the small rubber guard that had caught. A 30-second fix with his thumbnail. "Mechanic's habit," he said, standing. Vivian looked at him, not at the footrest, at him. "You're always doing that," she said quietly. "Doing what?" "Fixing the actual problem." Her voice was careful. "Not the one you think I need fixed." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He picked up his market bag and they kept walking. That evening he sat in his truck outside her building for an extra few minutes before driving home. He wasn't sure what that was about. He suspected he knew exactly what it was about, and he wasn't ready to do anything with that information yet. 2 weeks later, a Tuesday, she wasn't at the coffee place. She didn't answer his text. He told himself it was nothing. She was busy, she had appointments, she had a life that had nothing to do with him. By Thursday, when the second text went unread, he felt the specific unease of a person who has allowed themselves to hope for something and is now watching that hope sit very quietly in a corner, not looking at him. Saturday, no market. He went alone. Bought the BC peaches out of stubbornness, and they weren't as good. Then, 11 days after her last message, he got one. "Sorry, I needed some distance. I don't think this is a good idea." He read it 3 times, then set his phone face down on his desk and stared at the wall of his office for longer than he'd like to admit. He should have let it go. He knew that. He was not a man who chased things, who forced conversations, who decided he knew better than another person what was good for them. He had always believed that respect was expressed in restraint as much as in action. But something about the message didn't sit right. It was too clean, too definitive for a person he had come to know as someone who weighed her words carefully. Vivian Aldred didn't say, "I don't think this is a good idea," without a reason she wasn't saying. He ran into her brother 2 weeks later, not by plan, a mutual contact's retirement party in Gastown. A man named Philip who had Vivian's same careful posture and a habit of answering questions before they were fully asked. They spoke briefly. Philip mentioned, in a way that seemed intended, that Vivian had been dealing with something, that their mother had gotten involved, that there had been a conversation about appearances and the law firm's reputation, and what it meant for Vivian to be seen publicly with. He paused. Someone whose profile could create complications. Nathan kept his expression neutral. What kind of complications? Philip looked at him steadily. My mother is very invested in the idea that Vivian's recovery should look a specific way, that who Vivian associates with should reinforce certain narratives. Nathan understood someone like him, a man who'd started in a garage, whose company had been built from dirt and pragmatism, not family capital or credential, wasn't part of the image Vivian's mother had assembled for her daughter's re-emergence into professional life. He drove home in silence. He told himself again to let it go. He almost did. It was his assistant, a forthright woman named Dara, who inadvertently set the next thing in motion. There's a Dr. Aldred on the line, Dara said, appearing in his office doorway one Thursday morning. She says it's not urgent, but she'd like 5 minutes. He picked up the phone. I owe you an explanation, Vivian said. No preamble, that at least was familiar. You don't. I'd like to give you one anyway, a beat. Can we meet somewhere, not the coffee place? They met at a small harborside bench near the seawall. She was already there when he arrived, watching a pair of herons standing motionless in the shallows. He sat beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. My mother called your company, she said. He hadn't known that. She spoke to someone in your PR department, said she was a journalist with questions about a contract dispute. She was trying to build leverage. Vivian's voice was even, but her jaw was tight. I found out 3 days ago. When I confronted her, she said she was protecting me, that my situation was complicated enough without, and I'm quoting, entanglements with someone who has no concept of what our family has built. The herons hadn't moved. She sent me the message, Vivian said, from my phone while I was asleep. He looked at her. I only found out because I went through my sent folder looking for something else. A pause. I was mortified and angry, and I needed time before I could. She stopped. I should have come to you sooner. Vivienne. I know. I mean, he took a breath. I knew the message wasn't you, not because I didn't believe it, but because it didn't sound like you, the way you write, the way you build sentences. He looked out at the water. You never use "I don't think" when you mean "I don't want." Silence. That's unsettlingly observant, she said. Occupational hazard, I negotiate contracts. She looked at him for a long time. The autumn light was flat and gray, but it made the water look polished, like pewter. Something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, not the way it does in films, but in the way of someone making a decision they've been resisting. My mother is going to be difficult about this, she said. Okay. She's very good at difficult. I've built roads through boreal forest, he said. I've survived regulatory committees and municipal appeals, and one particularly memorable land use hearing in Thunder Bay that lasted 6 days. I'll manage. The corner of her mouth turned. Nathan. Vivienne. Thank you, she said, for not deciding to be less than you are because of any of this. He didn't have an answer for that, so he just sat with her in the gray light, watching the herons, until they both felt ready to move. Margaret Aldred had the kind of posture that communicated disapproval without requiring a word to be spoken. She received them in the sitting room of her West Vancouver home, a room that smelled of furniture polish and consequence. She was a woman in her late 60s, small and precise, who had apparently spent 4 decades as a Crown attorney before retirement. She sat in a chair that might as well have been a bench, and she watched Nathan settle across from her with the expression of someone evaluating evidence. Vivienne was beside him. She had told him on the drive over that she didn't need him to defend her. He'd said he knew. She said she meant it. He said he knew that too. Mr. Beauchamp, Margaret said, I'll be direct. Please, he said. My daughter has spent 2 years rebuilding her life after a catastrophic loss. Her career, her identity, her sense of what her future holds. She is not in a position to take on complications. She's in the room, Vivian said quietly. Margaret did not look at her. I'm not a complication, Nathan said. I understand why you see me that way. I also understand that you sent a message from your daughter's phone without her knowledge, and that you contacted my company under false pretenses. He kept his voice level. I'm not here to argue about any of that. I'm here because Vivian asked me to be, and because I think you deserve to hear directly that I have no intention of disappearing. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Whatever she had expected, it wasn't that. You have no idea what this family requires, she said. No, he agreed, but Vivian does, and she gets to decide what her life requires, not us. The room was very still. Vivian reached over and placed her left hand over his. He didn't move. Margaret's eyes dropped to it for a moment, then rose again. I lost her once, Margaret said, and something in her voice was different now, smaller. When she had the accident, they called me from the hospital and I thought, she stopped. I've been afraid ever since, of losing her again, of anything taking her backward. I know, Vivian said softly. I don't, Margaret's jaw worked. I don't know who you are, she said to Nathan. I don't know if you're reliable. That's fair, he said. I'd be glad to let you find out. Another silence, longer. You're less irritating than I expected, Margaret said finally. That's the kindest thing anyone's ever said to me, Nathan replied. Vivian made a sound that was almost a laugh. 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning in February, Nathan drove Vivian to a physiotherapy session at a clinic in Kitsilano. He waited in the truck with a coffee and a podcast he wasn't really listening to. She came out 40 minutes later. She crossed the parking lot toward him, not with the careful, conserving efficiency he was used to watching, but with something different. She was crying, quietly, with her face tipped up slightly, the way people do when they're trying not to let tears fall. He was out of the truck before he'd made a conscious decision to move. Hey. I squeezed the therapist's hand, she said, with my right hand. Her voice was unsteady. On the nerve response test, it was the first. There's been nothing for 2 years, and today She pressed her lips together. Nathan had the particular quality, Vivian had told him once, of knowing when to speak and when to just be there. He'd been quietly proud of that. He was there. He put his arms around her carefully in the way he'd learned she liked, not enveloping, not protective in the way that feels like containing, but present. His chin rested at her temple. She leaned into him with her whole weight for the first time. It might not mean anything, she said into his shoulder. The therapist said not to get ahead of it. I know. It's just a squeeze. I know. But it was something. Yeah, he said quietly, it was something. They stood in the Kitsilano parking lot in the February cold, the mountains across the inlet pale and snow-covered in the distance. A crow landed on a nearby bin, regarded them briefly and left. Vivian pulled back, looked at him. Her eyes were red, but her expression was the clearest he'd ever seen it. I spent 2 years being very carefully practical about my life, she said. About what was possible, what was realistic, what was wise. You are not particularly practical. Also know that. You drove 40 minutes each way just to sit in a parking lot. Good podcast. She shook her head, the ghost of a smile. Why do you do that? He thought about it, genuinely, the way he'd learned to think about things in her company, without rushing toward an answer. Because you matter, he said. Not the surgeon, not the partner, not the recovery. You, he shrugged slightly, seemed like something worth showing up for. Vivian Aldred, who had rebuilt herself from the inside out through 2 years of pure determined will, who had stood in boardrooms and courtrooms and hospital hallways and never once given anyone the satisfaction of watching her waver, looked at him, and her face simply went open. I love you, she said. The words came out plainly, like a fact she'd finished deliberating over and was now prepared to state for the record. He hadn't expected her to say it first. Somehow that felt exactly right. Yeah, he said, I know, me too. She laughed, full and genuine, the kind he'd been quietly collecting for months. She pressed her forehead to his collarbone. He folded his hand over the back of hers, the right one, the one that had just, for the first time in 2 years, held on. Outside, the February sky broke open briefly, and a strip of pale winter light crossed the mountains and the inlet and the parking lot and them, and didn't ask to mean anything but did. I keep thinking about the parking lot. Not the gala, not the confrontation with Margaret, not even the moment Vivian told me she loved me, though that one lives somewhere quiet and permanent in my chest. I keep thinking about a February parking lot in Kitsilano, 40 minutes from my office, where I sat in a truck with a cold coffee waiting for a woman who didn't ask me to be there. And how that felt, to me, like the most obvious place in the world to be. I don't think we talk enough about what it actually costs to show up for someone. Not the grand gestures. Those are easy, in a way. They have a clear shape, a beginning and end, applause built in. I mean the ordinary showing up. The Tuesday drives. The market trips where you buy the peaches you don't even like because it reminds you of an argument she won. The sitting in silence while someone decides whether or not they trust you yet. Nathan did that, quietly, without announcement. He's not a man who performs his own decency. He just acts. He straightens the footrest. He flags down the cyclist. He reads the difference between I don't think and I don't want in a text message, and he holds that knowledge carefully without weaponizing it. That's what I'd call real integrity. Not the kind you announce. The kind that shows up in the small decisions, when no one is watching and nothing is at stake except your own sense of who you are. And Vivian, what she went through required something I genuinely respect. She lost the thing that had defined her for over a decade, and she didn't collapse into the loss. She rebuilt, not loudly, not publicly, but methodically, honestly, with her whole remaining capacity. Occupational therapy, 12 months of relearning, a left hand that learned to catch a napkin mid-air because a right hand couldn't. That kind of persistent, unglamorous effort, the kind with no audience and no guarantee of return, that takes something most people underestimate in themselves until they have no choice but to find it. What I notice, looking at both of them, is that the moment things shifted wasn't dramatic. It was a parking lot, a hand squeeze, a therapist's clinical notation of nerve response that meant, in the language of a woman who had spent 2 years being very carefully practical about hope, that something was still alive in her. The harm Margaret caused came from fear. That's worth naming plainly. She interfered, she manipulated, she sent a message from her daughter's phone, and all of it grew from a place of genuine terror about losing her child again. Fear dressed as control. It's one of the oldest human patterns there is, and understanding it doesn't excuse it, but it does make it legible. Nathan understood it. He said so, directly, to her face, and that clarity, the ability to see someone clearly without either excusing or condemning them, that's a form of wisdom I think is rarer than it looks. What I take from their story is this: the quality of your attention is a form of love. Vivian had been surrounded, for 2 years, by people who looked at her injury. Nathan looked at her. There's a difference, and she felt it immediately, even when she didn't trust it yet. Most of us know how to be seen at our best. Very few of us have been seen at our most uncertain, and chosen anyway. That's what staying is, not the easy part, the whole point.